Well, I want to welcome you back to session 2 of our very important, I think, panel discussion on church safety and security. We appreciate so much George Harvey, who is with us in session 1, who's our legal counsel here at Southeastern Seminary. And in his place for this session, we're excited to have Dr. Mike Lawson join us. Mike, share with us your title, what you do here for us. I know, but go ahead and tell them.
Okay, I'm Mike Lawson. I'm Director of Campus Security. I've been here now about 14 years in that role. I also serve as an auxiliary police officer with the town of Wake Forest, and so that's where we get our police powers for campus.
Sure, and go ahead and share them a little bit about what you can share about your past and some of your past experiences in law enforcement.
Well, I came to Southeastern out of law enforcement background, so I was a deputy sheriff in South Carolina for a while, and then with the U.S. Secret Service for about a year and a half before I realized, God wanted me to move on from there. But great experiences, great training while I was there.
Sure. And so we're so glad you're with us. We were going to have another law enforcement, active law enforcement member with us, and at the last minute, he got called away on a duty call. So we're thankful that you're with us, Mike. And of course, Ron's still with us, Stephen. So we're going to talk through some of these preventative issues. And then the last session, we're going to actually talk, unfortunately, about what if you're in an active situation. So let's talk prevention. So Mike, let's just think for a minute. What are some of the security issues, just in a general way? What are some security issues that we wish every church might know about?
Well, we touched on some of those under the insurance side. I think one thing I've certainly learned being at seminary is there's this sort of mentality, I think, sometimes of, we go to seminary or we go to church and, we kind of pass through the force field, and that can't be penetrated while we're there. And so I think there's this whole mentality sometimes of, we're safe while we're at school or we're safe while we're at church. And while certainly that mentality, I think, is changing due to a lot of what's happened in our country, some issues that we've had recently in the news, I still see that issue a lot, and so I think part of this is educating churches and helping them to understand the many issues, from children to youth to adults to physical security of the church. So I think there's many issues that we could cover, and hopefully we'll touch on some of those this morning. But I think just getting past that mentality of well, I'm at church, so nothing's going to happen.
Sure. And so let's just bounce off that. So Ron, in your work as a risk manager, you do a lot of assessment. And go ahead and in this response, if you would, talk about some of the assessment tools that might be available to churches online and otherwise. But let's talk about what are some of the biggest security oversights that you see in your experience with churches?
I think one is just a lack of training and planning, and having comprehensive emergency preparedness and crisis management plans. What to do, training not just staff but congregation members, training people that are in your church and schools. We see it in schools a lot. But a lot of times they'll go through drills, and we'll do drills and things, but there's not a application of the policy or the procedure that's actually written. And so, and then the other thing, and I'm sure we're going to touch on this in a minute, but is the collaboration with local law enforcement and emergency responders that are in the communities of these churches. I go to some of these churches that are in rural areas, and they don't even think about, I need to collaborate with my local sheriff's department or my local police department in developing our emergency response plan. And so I see that a lot.
Sure. And so in your work with assessment with churches, are there tools that churches can access, or do they really, is it smarter for them to contact an expert like you, or are there some automatic self-led kind of assessment process that they can go through?
There, in risk management, because we're covering so many different areas, and I talked earlier about the triangle, that making sure that your policies, the risk management piece, the insurance piece, the safety and security, they're all touching each other somehow. There's something that closes the loop, and so we talk about assessments that are on-site assessments that are called whole church assessments, so that we're looking at all those aspects, not just looking at surveillance cameras. So there are assessment tools out there, but a lot of times staff don't know where to start. We were just talking during the break with someone that, just brainstorming to understand how to get a beginning place and, and a plan for moving forward and developing these plans.
Yeah, and Stephen, you were talking to me about, of it's called Safe Church?
It's called Safe Church. There's handouts out front, and I can put it on your website, but it's a national entity that works with churches. We have our affiliation through Guide One Insurance, and so if you're a Guide One policyholder, you get Safe Church for free. So it is something you'd have to pay for if your insurance company's not doing that for you.
But it'd be something to ask your insurance company about, wouldn't it?
Oh, most definitely. It's and in there, it's the basics on how to build a risk management team and all like that. But at the end of the day, it's best if you have an expert
Sure.
like Ron help guide you through it, because each church, as you know, is very different.
Ron, you mentioned security cameras. Mike, let's talk about technology for a minute. What are some of the technological things that maybe a church ought to be thinking about in terms of again, we're on prevention. So what are some technological opportunities they ought to take advantage of?
Well, some of that comes back to how much money have you got. I mean, that's honestly a lot of times where the rubber meets the road, and it takes budget to do that. But there's a number of things I've thought of when thinking about this question beforehand. Access control, you can obviously go to the extreme of having cards and schedules for doors to open. But even on a simpler scale, one thing we've done at our church is just part of access control is controlling where do people come into the church at. There used to be at our church sort of the mentality of every door got opened on Sunday morning, and there were probably about 7 entry points around the church that people could come in from any angle and immediately have access to the children's department or to the school, to the classrooms or anywhere in the church. And so part of what we've done at our church is funnel people where we want them to go. And so in other words, you don't have to physically unlock every door in a building and allow access through every point, but have 2 main entrances. Or at our church, we have 3 main entrances. And when people come in, they know they're going to be met by a greeter team. We usually have a security person standing nearby, kind of making face contact with people as they're coming in. And that can be a discouragement. If somebody's looking for a soft target and they realize that they have to pass sort of a greeter team to get in, that's going to, in some ways, prevent that. In fact, it was one of the ladies at the greeter team, I think at Bellevue, who first spotted the gun in that incident. And so again, they came through an entrance that was being watched, and it allowed them to prevent that. On the other hand, there's things like cameras. Again, with cameras, there's, 2 sides of it. One is, are they being actively monitored, or do you have them just for sort of after action recordings? And so I think there's a good way to use them that's monitored and looking and watching, versus are you just going to go back and look at the recording later? So I think there's a good way for cameras to be used, and then one that's just kind of after the fact. But there's obviously other things you can do. Alarm systems. I mean, obviously this is, wouldn't be in effect on a Sunday morning, but even on a Sunday morning, are there panic alarms? Are there, is there a way to quickly notify law enforcement or quickly get that word out once something has started happening? And then certainly children's areas. That's a huge area to think about some sort of security, and it can be anything. I've seen some churches that do something as simple as a sticker on the child's back that corresponds to a sticker the parent takes with them, to something more complicated like a pager or some sort of device that would notify the parent directly. But I think it's important, again, as somebody mentioned in the first session, you have custody of that child while that parent's away. And so you've got to make sure there's something in place there, that this is, just not anybody can walk up and pick up a child. I think that's another big liability area.
While we're talking about children and youth again, is there anything else? I mean, we covered some of that in the first session, but that's such an area that we want to make sure we're clear on. And I sometimes I assume common sense, and I also recognize that common sense is often a superpower. And so, I do hope that anybody who hears this, and, it's interesting who will hear all of this. This will go out to not only pastors and alumni and friends of the seminary, but it certainly is going to go out to students. This will be a required video in at least one of our classes. I know a professor is going to use it, and we'll push this out in some of our internships and mentorships. And so some of our young pastors who haven't pastored before, to recognize the need, even in the church planting stages, even in those early stages of church life, to make sure that direct access to your children is obviously not something that is available. I was a pastor for over 20 years, and as I've mentioned before, consulted with a lot of churches since, and even in my own pastoral life, some pretty tragic events took place, not necessarily in the churches I pastored, but in surrounding churches with children. And so, anybody have anything else that they want to add? You want to add, Steve?
Just to add a comment about cameras, and unfortunately, another growing trend in the United States is arson. They're burning down our churches, and there's no evidence. So the camera, believe it or not, it can help that, and you can strategically put that. Ron works with schools and churches on where to put cameras, and you can strategically put these cameras, and you can get the license tag, you can get the individual, and capture these people.
The technology has grown greatly, and there's some great technology out there. Like Mike said, if you got the funds, but there are some other things too. We just did a daycare center, and believe it or not, the daycare door was not functioning properly and wasn't shutting. And the daycare, this is the entrance into the daycare, and it's right next to a major highway. And it'd been like that. And when I met with the pastor and the senior leadership, they said, we got the safest daycare in the world. But a lot of times the assessment points out things that need improvements, or there's also some ways to build in some safety that, from a cost perspective, that you can look at too. So.
Yeah, and when you think about the church's programming, preschool, daycares, different things that churches do programmatically, a tragic story that I was not involved with, but a dear friend of mine was a large church in another state where a custodian had been filming children in the locker rooms in the Family Life Center for years. He died of a heart attack. The only way they found out is he died of a heart attack, and they found him, a door would not shut because he had died in the doorway, and he had the camera with him. And they went to his home and found years of videos, and had a simple security camera inside the gym been placed probably where you could monitor what was happening, not in the locker rooms, but in the gym part. Right. They would have seen him going in and out with a camera over the years. And so horrible multi-generational impact on that church because he had been doing it for so long. And so a tragedy out there in a lot of places. So let's think about that as we continue to talk. But let's move to the security team concepts. I want us to take as much time as we need to because I know a lot of people are interested in this. So let's talk, Mike. Let's talk a little bit about training security teams, and then Stephen, get ready because we're going to have to talk about concealed weapons policies. We're going to have to talk about whether or not training helps liability and some of those questions too. But first, let's talk about the training itself. Any thoughts on training security teams and how they ought to be trained?
Yeah, I think it's imperative you do training. I mean, I think the wrong mentality is to think that, we can just allow everybody who has a concealed weapon to carry it at church and then we've covered it. Because as we mentioned in the first hour, just about anybody can get a concealed permit to carry a weapon, but it doesn't mean that they're trained to prevent somebody to take it from them. It doesn't mean that they're trained to, shoot very well. I mean, I know a lot of the courses here is basically you just learn, as long as you can show that you can shoot it and reload it, you've passed. And so it doesn't necessarily mean there's any proficiency with the weapon. And so I think it's imperative to do training above and beyond just carrying a concealed weapon. And it may entail, bringing someone in to teach better shooting techniques, to teach them when they can and cannot shoot, which ought to be covered in the concealed weapons class, but there needs to be more follow-up with that. And so I think, again, the wrong thing to do is just to say anybody can carry, but what needs to happen is there needs to be some plan in place. And I'm not saying discourage other people from carrying, but I think even if you're going to allow concealed weapons permits people to carry in the church, then they also need to understand, look, there is a team in place to handle a situation. And so unless it is your life and your immediate life that is threatened, what you need to do in a situation is just duck and cover and let the team handle it. Let the ones who are trained and who are part of the plan be the ones that handle it, so that we don't get into a situation like we mentioned earlier where, all of a sudden there's 15 people standing up and pulling guns and who knows where the bullets are flying. I've laughed at some churches and said, the first thing I'm going to do if an active shooting starts is I'm going to duck first and then see who's left, and then we'll deal with it. And unfortunately, I think sometimes that's the case. And so I think there's got to be a plan in place, and there needs to be a backup plan. We always laugh about in the SWAT community, which I served on a SWAT team for 13 years, still active on one, and we always say, the plan is as good as first contact, because it seems like the first time you meet the bad guy, then everything changes. And so even have a backup plan, have redundant plans in place to deal with situations like that. So yeah, I think there's got to be more training and planning done in these type of situations. And
I think an important issue, which I know you all will want to comment on, and I think George brought it up to some degree, and during our break here live, we had some great questions that were asked, and I'm trying to make sure that we're addressing as well for everyone else. One of the issues is, does the church actually have a policy about can you carry weapons on the property of this church or not? And does that matter? Should the church have a written policy that says, yes, you can carry your concealed weapon on the property of this church or not? Does that matter in any way or not? And I'm looking to either one of you all for that.
The insurance company wants one, and they're not going, like I said, they're going to use intentional act not to pay the claim.
And I think you have to take a common sense approach to it too. Some churches are very large, and whatever your policy is, you have to talk about enforcement of that policy. How do you enforce the policy? So there's that balance that you have to take. But from an insurance perspective, I will tell you, they're going to frown on it extremely hard. There may be some out there that will accept it, but most of them are not going to write that policy if that is your policy. So you have to take a strong look at it, and that goes back to assessments. What neighborhood is your church in? I've seen some neighborhoods that. I wouldn't go to. I would want to be armed to go to that church. Neighborhoods are different, and locations of churches are different too. So,
yeah. So let's talk about this for a minute. Does everyone on the security team need to be carrying a weapon?
Yeah, I would say no, not necessarily. I mean, I think there's some trend even to go away from the name security and to call them more like a safety team or something like that. So you can have members on a team who just watch the parking lot, who are the ones meeting at the door, making that facial recognition. I know at our church right now, it seems like the policy is find Mike. So there might be two or three of us who are armed at the church who are kind of the ones that they will go to if it gets that serious. But then there's other team members who are just at the doors to recognize people, to greet people, to meet people, and have that first contact with them, and who watch the parking lots and walk the corridors between, and doesn't necessarily have to be armed.
In the church where I currently serve, a red lanyard means I'm carrying a weapon. Black lanyard means I'm not. And red lanyards are, in this particular context, fortunately, they're law enforcement members, and so they're actually trained people, and so that way they can distinguish between the two. I thought that made kind of sense to me. I thought that was a pretty good idea. Yeah. So let me ask you this, Stephen. So from an insurance standpoint, if we go to great lengths and train that security team, does that help our insurance? Does that get our premium lower?
Yes.
Do we have to pay you less money?
Well, what we want, first of all, is we want a formal safety committee established, which, like Mike hit on, as well as Ron, you've got someone monitoring the parking lot. So you got on a given Saturday or Wednesday or any time church events are being held, that their eyes and ears out there watching. So that would be in that formal safety program that Ron would help establish. And then back to the insurance piece, you want to add the endorsement coverage for, well, we call them resource officers. That's our word that we use in the insurance industry. But they're certified armed law enforcement.
And so while we're talking about insurance again, talk to us a little bit more. We mentioned this group affiliated program, the fact that insurance companies are more and more interested in churches maybe coming together, or
Right.
for churches who have a hard time getting insured.
Correct.
So
Churches
talk
are
to us a
going.
little bit about that.
The trend, unfortunately, is churches are being non-renewed, or their insurance premiums are going up astronomically. The coverages are being taken away. So, with that, one of the solutions to this is forming a group affiliated program, a GAP program. It's where you take a group of churches under, it could be under leadership of a Baptist convention or local or even the seminary. You could have a group of churches come together, and you take like 100, 150 churches, and then you bring Ron and myself in, and we build a solid risk management program, and then you're able to fill in the gaps in coverages. We're able to bring in more resources because economically now your premiums are coming down, your coverages are going up, and now there's extra money there to pay for the risk assessments. Also having a resource officer during church events.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I'm thinking about Southern Baptist organization and polity, and I'm thinking on the state convention level and the associational level, how they're, especially in terms of the risk management opportunities, that might actually be something that networks of churches might want to consider doing together. Let me ask you this one. This is a really important one to me, and this actually is a thread that has been woven through several of the presentations that we've put together. Again, some of the folks who are going to be watching this are brand new pastors. They're in their first pastorates. They're recent graduates, perhaps, and they're looking for best practices. And so, one of the things that I've encouraged them to do when we did a session on funerals. We've done a session on other issues, to where I've really encouraged them, when you're new to a town, you're new to the community. Here are people you ought to go meet. You ought to go meet the funeral home director and talk to them about this. You really should. You should spend time with them and get to know them and understand that if this is the most common funeral home that our members use, that you and I are going to get to be good friends, and so we need to know how to work together. I encourage them to go to the hospitals, even before they have people there, to kind of learn the layouts, get to know maybe the chaplains or kind of how the system works. Every hospital has its own system. But in this scenario, we're talking about first responders. And so to get to know your local sheriff, your local police departments, your fire department, do something nice for them as a church, by the way. Take some cookies down to the firehouse, and love on those policemen and love on those firemen a little bit. But getting to know those first responders, and let's talk about that even more. Mike, we were talking about this a little bit the other day, I think, in my office. Not only just get to know them, but to have them come to you and do, in a sense, their own risk assessment as first responders, so they'll know where to go and things like that. You want to comment on that, any?
Yeah, that's one thing that we do here at Southeastern. Our local fire department and our local police department as well look for places to train. They look for places that they can go and practice. And so, to give you a couple examples from just here on campus, the fire department will call ever so often, and you might see them over here quite a few times at the building we're not using over here on the corner, and we'll open that building up for them and let them practice running steps or doing responses over there. Or at nighttime, we'll open Staley and they'll practice running up the end stairways, which is 3 floors of steps, dragging their hoses and carrying the gurneys and things. And so it gives them a place to go and practice, but at the same time, and train, but at the same time, they're learning our campus. And so if I call the fire department and say, hey, we've got an emergency on the 3rd floor of Staley, they know how to get there now. And so that's one thing that we do here. Same thing with the police department, especially if you've got a department that has a canine unit, they're looking for places to practice searches. And so we'll do the same thing. If it's midnight and Wake Forest canine unit wants to train over here, we'll open any building on campus that they want to come and train in, and they'll come in and hide the drugs, and I'll just tell them, make sure you find them, right? Make sure you don't leave them anywhere.
So that's what was in my office.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I promise I don't know anything about
right.
that, Mike.
But we don't open offices, I will say that. But they'll come in with their dogs and train. And so from my side, I see that as a plus, because they're learning our campus. They're learning what buildings are where. They're learning the corridors, how to get to places. And so you could do the same thing in your church. Offer your church as a training site. Offer your church as a place that they can come and call and do some training in, because not only then are they getting a place to train, but also if you need them one day, they know where to go. They know where the children's wing is. They know what it means when you say the back building or the side entrance, and it gives them a chance to really get to know your campus as well.
Yeah, and Ron, in your world, how would you consult a church in those kinds of areas?
Well, I totally agree with what Mike said. The collaboration between the pastor and the staff there with the local law enforcement and emergency response is critical. Just met with a pastor in Durham, I won't say what church, but he's been in the community for 10 years and never met with the police chief, never met with the sheriff's department. And so we collaborate. We actually set up a meeting for those folks to meet. That's critical in your planning stage, is to get your local. I've not met a sheriff yet that would not go out to a church and visit a church, or a law enforcement officer. So having that relationship is key. That's really a starting point to build your emergency preparedness and crisis management plans.
I mentioned earlier that we were going to have another law enforcement official here with us. He actually is a sheriff in the area, and he does this. And so we were looking forward to his testimony. And from the pastoral standpoint, from the ministerial standpoint, this is just smart, folks. I mean, if you're a pastor in a community, develop a ministry to these first responders. Take advantage of the opportunity to meet with the sheriff or the police chief or the fire chief or these guys, and have an opportunity to minister to them. A lot of these folks are looking for chaplains. They're looking for people to send people to when they're hurting. A lot of these folks go through a lot of tragedy and crisis in life, and so you never know what kind of ministry bridge might be developed on the pastoral side, as well as them wanting to take care of you. And so the more that you have them on your property and you're ministering to them, the more they're knowledgeable they're going to be of what might happen on your property and be there to take care of you. It's just a great relationship to have. And so we want to highly encourage that. And so if I have the police department come, and I have the fire department come, and I have good policies, and I'm talking to my insurance agent,
you're now a great risk.
Am I?
So you're going to get preferred insurance
That's
rates.
good. So my money goes down. I have to pay you less money now.
Yes.
That's all I'm after, to pay you less money.
Ounce of prevention's worth a pound of care.
No, that's great.
Hey, I'll add one thing there. We mentioned getting to know people, but also get to know your insurance agent. I mean,
no, seriously, yeah.
Just for Steve is ours here. He's one of our brokers, and so one thing, it's not like my personal insurance. I think of my house, I might go and buy my insurance, and I never see anybody from there, or my car insurance, and I do it online, and I never see anybody. But it's critical in the setting of a church, an institution, something bigger like that, to have them out and build that relationship. So I can, I know I can shoot Steve an email anytime, and I'll get a response back on these questions that I have. And so that's another important relationship to build.
That really is a smart word. Yeah. So what we're talking about in this session, it really is about open and closed, and what the relationship between those two words means on your campus, from a policy standpoint, from an access standpoint, from a training standpoint, from the liability standpoint. We want the church to be open to people, but at the same time, in today's climate and environment, where there's wisdom to understand what that word means, and to be able to do that wisely in a way. So thank you all so much for this conversation. In the next session, we're going to move to a very unfortunate conversation. What if there is an active situation taking place in your church building or on your property or in your presence? What do you do? How should you handle that? And so that's what we're going to do in our final session. So we look forward for you joining us then. Thank you.